All right, everyone, it is time. We now have the State of Play behind us and also Summer Game Fest wrapping up. And it was really those two events that we needed to see before we can make some kind of conclusion as to what we can or cannot expect from Sony, because those were really the only two things we were waiting on in the short term. And now it's a matter of talking about the slate and also maybe expectations going into 2025 and beyond, because it is something where going into this year, there's been, as we've said on LTPS, like a lot of pent-up demand from the PlayStation community, wondering what's going on with PlayStation Studios, where are all these big game announcements, and I think a lot of pressure has sort of mounted up even more after the very successful and really strong showing from Microsoft with the recent Xbox Game Showcase, which was quite good. It was extremely good, to be honest. The pacing was great, just trailer, new game announcement, here's a new look at this game, here's some gameplay, here's a release window, really strong show. And so let's kind of go over the entire release slate and I guess go into more of a analysis about just the sort of minute ways that these companies tend to make these kind of announcements, because it really is a fascinating thing, right? Especially with how Sony's been doing it lately. This is something where I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but we've seen this for going on 4 years now with the PlayStation 5 cycle, and this goes into the PS4 cycle, really, which is when Sony stopped going to events like E3, Paris Games Week, TGS, Gamescom, these reliable places that they were going to show up every single time, and we knew they were going to say something. And now it's a matter of, they usually do a state of play around this time. Sometimes they do September showcases. Oh, wait, now it's a state of play in June or the May area, right? And there's a lot of announcements that are sometimes relegated to the PlayStation blog. They just kind of go about it in their own way nowadays. It's like predictable, but also not predictable, if that makes sense, especially because a lot of these announcements sometimes show up at Summer Game Fest now. It's interesting because when you look at 2024, right, this year, you might almost think to yourself that there's not a whole lot going on for PlayStation 5, although that's clearly not true, right? There's actually been a ton of game releases this year. We've already seen The Last of Us Part 2 remastered, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Helldivers 2 shipped, Rise of the Ronin, Stellar Blade. Those are games that have already come out before we're about halfway through the year, and we still have, as we just found out, Concord coming out, Astrobot, Lego Horizon Adventures, Silent Hill 2 as a timed exclusive, also Until Dawn. There's no major tentpole releases in there, as we have also known for a while now from Sony's language and their financial earnings, that there's no planned major sequels or tentpole release games that they expect to move 10 plus million units. None of these games are what that's, none of those games fit into that criteria, but that's still a lot of software, right? I mean, it's one of those weird things where if you had all those announcements baked into a single PlayStation showcase, one might actually argue that that's a really strong showcase, but the reality is all those games that we just listed off are scattered about, right? They show up in State of Plays, the blog, Summer Game Fest, PlayStation Showcase. They really kind of run the gamut nowadays, but if they were to sort of do this the way they used to, I think you can make a strong case that would have been a very good PlayStation Showcase. But obviously it's just a lot different nowadays, right? So it's more of a, I guess, perception thing. Now, not to take away from like Microsoft's recent showing of the Xbox Game Showcase, I thoroughly enjoyed that show, especially since a lot of you know my take on these live streams is generally whether most people think they're like trash or amazing or just kind of okay. Like, I like watching all of them because I just like watching video games. But obviously some are a lot stronger than the others, and this was without a doubt, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people are kind of feeling the same way, it was one of their strongest shows in a long time. I mean, this is something I brought up on the Spawncast a few weeks ago when we were discussing some, the recent rumors about Project Latitude internally at Microsoft, how they're planning on shipping games on rival platforms, that primarily being PlayStation 5. And, I had brought up this point of like, for Microsoft, I may not agree with how they've gone about doing this in recent years, which is acquiring third-party publishers. Regardless of that, they have the teams now, they have the studios, they're ready to acknowledge this problem, this long-standing problem with Xbox, which has been, also studio management. That's been a core issue, and it remains to be seen if they'll be able to maintain that long-term, but IP was also a problem as well. But now they have a ton of studios. They have a release lineup that is eventually going to pay off, despite 2020 to even 2022, which was really rough for Microsoft, where they had practically nothing. It's going to take a lot of dry years until you start bearing the fruit of all those acquisitions. Even something going back to Compulsion Games in 2018, like eventually they're going to ship a game, right? And now we're seeing that with South of Midnight. Eventually they're going to have a very good showcase, and that's exactly what happened. They showed off a new trailer for Fable with some gameplay. South of Midnight got gameplay. Perfect Dark from the Initiative, I think had a very good, proper reveal and showing. Indiana Jones got more gameplay, Avowed got more gameplay, Gears of War E-Day, that might not have had proper gameplay, but that's one of those things where it's a very well-known established IP, so you can kind of get away with only doing a title card, maybe just a bare-bones mission statement about what that game is, as long as it's out there, right, and people know what it is and it's coming. That alone is enough to really excite that kind of audience, and that's just really scratching the surface. There were a lot of games in that showcase which really lined up well with their pacing also, right, which included a lot of third-party games, which, look, that's not really a problem. All three major manufacturers are going to have third-party games to pad out, what's going to end up being an hour-plus long sort of live stream. They all do it. That's not really a problem, obviously. But it's just holistically how they approached it, it was quite good. But I would make the argument, right, is that it took a long time for them to finally get there. And you can't necessarily expect that to happen again. One could even make the case that, well, a lot of these games we did already know about, but it's just how they chose to go about doing it, right? A lot of these games you may have already known about, but it's more exciting to see actual gameplay of something, a more formal reveal from the studio, or a confirmed date for a particular game, or knowing it's launching in a Game Pass or a release window. These things obviously are great no matter how you get them, but that's the thing with PlayStation, right? If it took that long for Microsoft to finally get there and having all those studios in-house, what I would actually sort of push back on here is when we go back to 2020 with the initial Future of Gaming live stream that Sony did for properly revealing PlayStation 5, right? I feel like not many people are remembering this point in time where I think for many PlayStation fans, some of the hardcore faithful, they always sort of reflect fondly on E3 2015 or 2016. Very strong shows, by the way. But it's one of those things where you can't do that often. That was the problem with the later PS4 life cycle, is that, oh great, they showed off Tsushima again, another Death Stranding trailer, more Last of Us Part 2. Maybe it's one of those things where people complaining about that versus how it is nowadays, they're not the same. I don't want to obviously put words in people's mouths, but it's something where those were, 2016, 2015, those were really strong E3 presentations. But it took another 4 or 5 years to get to 2020, which was, in my opinion, also a very strong show. You have to remember that 2020 live stream had Destruction All-Stars, which at the time we did not know that game was going to be as bad as it was, but, it's still a PS Studios game, so we had that, but also Spider-Man Miles Morales, Gran Turismo 7, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, Returnal, Sackboy Big Adventure, Astro's Playroom, Demon's Souls, Horizon Forbidden West. Those were all in a single live stream. That is absolutely nuts when you really look back on all those game announcements, and really that was a strong case for PlayStation 5 back in 2020. But hindsight's everything, right? I think some would obviously look back and go, oh well, some of those were cross-gen, or some didn't turn out all that well, like Destruction All-Stars obviously, or Astro's Playroom was a smaller game. But either way, it's like, in that moment, that was a very strong showing. It's just a matter of, it took 4-something years for us to finally, really 5-6 years to get to that point again for PlayStation's in-house studios. And that's why the company has been primarily leaning on a lot of exclusivity agreements or funding from outside studios and things like that, right? That's why PlayStation Studios is now this larger umbrella than what Worldwide Studios used to be. That was strictly first-party in-house teams. Now PS Studios is really a mix of first, second party, and also third party. Rise of the Ronin being our only third party PS Studios game, but you can see that that's how they're approaching it nowadays, right? But that, and also timed exclusivity, which the company still does humor, and I'd be curious to know if they're still going to be as aggressive as they were, considering their closest competitor is now openly shipping games on their platform, which is another point of contention for the Xbox Game Showcase, is that, some of those titles, one might also wonder, will they eventually come over to PlayStation 5? That's also an entirely separate conversation. It's just one of those things that I really started to think about more, which is, it depends on, I guess, how the company always chooses to announce these things, right? now all these game announcements are spread out over so many things. It almost feels like the company isn't communicating when they surely do, just in a different manner. When we look at PlayStation Studios right now, there are a number of teams that we know can say something. I would admit that with Naughty Dog and Santa Monica, they're probably those are probably in my head late life cycle PS5 games. If anything, they've got to be like 2027. Although I feel like these two studios could easily get away with just putting a title card out there, and that would excite people enough, despite them being very far away. But they could, in theory, do that. Some of the more short-term announcements that we could absolutely see, though: Fire Sprite's narrative horror game, assuming that's far along enough. Sucker Punch Productions, I think, is very clearly in a place where whenever they're ready to talk about the next Ghost of Tsushima or Ghost of whatever, I mean, that game is probably going to be 2026 in my opinion, but you got to figure they're ready to talk about that game. I consider Tsushima closer than Naughty Dog, by the way, considering they did both ship games in late 2020, that being the PS4 cycle, but Sucker Punch Productions is a very focused studio. They're only doing Tsushima, whereas Naughty Dog is a much larger studio spread across multiple game directors, multiple projects. We also know they canceled The Last of Us Online, so there's a lot going on with Naughty Dog and those moving parts, and they're also doing a new IP, which is it's going to take longer to establish versus an existing property where you already have a good foundation and a lot of assets as to what you're going to be building and going forward. So point being, Tsushima is probably, if I had to guess, probably a 2026 game. Guerrilla Games, though, what's funny is that we got the Lego Horizon game, but we still have more that we could see from them, like this in-house Horizon multiplayer game, which has been in the oven since 2018. Assuming that game is on track, or they've finally figured out a core gameplay loop, I have no idea what the status is on this game, but you got to figure it could be announced at any moment. Same for this Horizon remake that was certainly on the XDev leak. We know that game is coming. Blue Point Games, I think, is getting close enough to where they're like a big maybe. To where they could drop something. Insomniac, of course, with Spider-Man 2 DLC and a new Wolverine trailer, considering that was announced really soon, really early. That, and from the Insomniac breach, we know they've got other titles in the pipeline, so they could be announcing another title very soon as well. And then there's Haven, which Haven I would actually consider more of a maybe. That's only because I'm not even sure if they're really ready to show gameplay for Fair Games. It's so weird how we got dressed up cinematic, very Ubisoft-esque trailer, which makes sense for that studio for Fair Games, but then Concord got basically nothing, and now that game's shipping this year. But there's that, right? Then there's XDev, which we've still got that goopy monster game. We've got Sumo Digital's Project Carbon, which still is completely MIA. There's secret teams within PlayStation Studios, that being PS Studios Visual Arts, building a project that's in collaboration with Naughty Dog. We assume that's probably a new Uncharted. Then there's Jason Blundell's new team. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts right now with SIE. What we can safely say is that studios like Housemarque, Media Molecule, Bend are more than likely very far away from announcing something. Those are the kind of studios where we're going to start looking at, what they're up to once we get into like 2026, 27, Media Molecule is probably even further away at this point, but it's a matter of really having a 4 or 5 year turnover, right? We had it with PlayStation in 2020. I would have hoped 2023 would have been the year that we would have had all those big announcements from the studios that we just listed off. But it does seem very clear now that they're simply trying to wait until they have a better release window. That's why I did that one conversation at the start of this year saying Sony has a 2024 games problem, which was more discussing and looking at the release slate from announcement to actual shipping of those games. How long was that window? Is there some kind of pattern we can recognize? And it seemed like it was about 2 years, and PS5 was also the same thing, about 2 years, although those games actually shipped within 2 years with COVID game delays baked in. So that was actually quite impressive. That tells me that maybe they do have this sort of general, whether it's coming from the top down or on a studio by studio basis, this motivation to not say anything until they feel a little bit closer to pinning down a release window. And I would assume that's maybe the case because now we're in midway through 2024. We still don't know what these big tentpole 2025 and 6 games are, and we know they're coming. That's the one other thing we can be absolutely certain of. Because it was in the financial report how many times the company expects some pretty big spikes in fiscal year 25, 26 from their own software. So we know the games are coming. It's simply a matter of how they choose to talk about these things nowadays. And so, I'm not going to say for sure that means, oh, there's going to be another showcase this year. I'm not looking to hype an audience up or be this sort of, let be a Sony defense conversation or anything. I think you all know I'm not here to do that. But it does say to me that they're either planning on doing that, or possibly we will just have to wait right up until literally a year from now. But then you have a little bit more confidence knowing the next time they do talk about these things, they show us a proper gameplay reveal trailer, and then boom, guess what? It's coming out in 3 months. Or hey, here's Astro out of nowhere, and that's coming out in 3 months. Here's this Lego Horizon game that you had no idea we were actually making, and that's also shipping this year, right? Having a smaller window from announcement to release. And it greatly depends on where that's going to fit in with the PlayStation 5 Pro reveal, which is going to happen this year. And if it's anything like the PS4 Pro reveal, that means it'll be primarily about the hardware. It'll be like, hey, here's the console, here's Mark Cerny giving the mission statement about what this thing does and why you should want it, and here's what PSSR does and why it helps the console, maintain a near 4K image quality, and now these games can also use ray tracing effects and higher frame rates. And so you're probably going to get a lot of that with existing software, as in, hey, here's Spider-Man 2 or Ragnarok, these familiar games, and here's how we're improving them. It won't necessarily, I would assume, be new game announcements, which would, in a way, maybe even take away from PS5 Pro in that moment. So it depends on how they want to do that, or if they do a PS5 Pro sort of separate event, then a showcase later down the road. Although I think maybe a safer guess is we will have another State of Play before the year closes out. So it might just be something like that, because we've seen State of Plays run the gamut and actually have their own straight up PlayStation Studio announcements. So it's like we've got patterns, but we don't, right, for PlayStation nowadays. And I think it's just interesting that when you look at the 4 or 5 year turnover it sometimes takes, whether it's Microsoft or Sony, eventually you get those big major game announcements. I'm very happy that Microsoft got to finally have what seemed like a strong showing of software that is really exciting and encouraging for that platform. But yeah, I just think we gotta, it's just like the patience thing. That's all it is. There's really no other way around it. It's unfortunate, but we did get a lot of stuff announced recently, and this year does have a lot of software coming out. It seems like a lot of people don't like that. But it could also just be not liking the games, which is a fair complaint too. I totally sympathize with people that maybe are not into the kind of software that we get nowadays from PlayStation, but I still think there's a lot of really good stuff to play across all studios and all platforms. So with that in mind, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation, and I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.